What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to My Social Life. This is the podcast where you can hear the real stories behind the people on social media. I'm your host, Jacob Kelly, and I have a special announcement to make today. My Social Life is entering into a partnership with Trufan. That's right. We got our first official sponsor of the podcast. And I just wanted to jump on today quickly to kind of break down this partnership, what's happening, what's changing, what's staying the same, how this all came about in the first place, because I just appreciate everybody that's listened to this podcast. I've been doing this for almost 2 years now. The first episode came out at the end of July 2018. And whether you started listening a week ago, a month ago, a year ago, or 2 years ago, I appreciate every single person that's taken the time to listen to one of my episodes, whether it be an interview, a takeaways episode, a bonus episode, however you found this podcast and however you like to consume it. I appreciate each and every single one of you. So the first thing you're probably wondering is who or what is Trufan? So I just want to give you a little bit of background on them before I really kind of get into the story and everything. And one thing too I want to make clear is they didn't ask me to record this podcast. That's not part of the agreement that we came to. I wanted to do this myself. I told them I was going to do it. They, of course, were totally cool with it. But I just really wanted to, like I said, I want to give you the context, the listener the context into everything. I want to be as transparent as I possibly can. So Trufan is a company based out of Toronto, and their goal is to democratize social data. I feel like this next section here is going to feel a little bit like an ad, so just bear with me through this. It's not an ad. And like I said, I'm not being paid to say this or even record any of this with this episode. But Trufan's goal, like I said, is to democratize social data. So essentially how it works is they want to take the big data that enterprise level clients have been using to make social decisions on social media and make it available to SMBs, small, medium businesses. And so in the fall of 2019, they acquired a company and their platform called SocialRank. And SocialRank has a ton of features, but the quickest way to explain it is SocialRank allows you to rank your followers on social media, hence the name SocialRank. So the two platforms they have right now are Instagram and Twitter, and you can go through your followers, you can rank them by most followed, most engaged, most value, which weighs a combination of your followers, your likes, your comments, your engagement rate. So you can rank your followers by a bunch of different things, bunch of different metrics, set filters, a whole bunch of stuff. And what you can also do, you can then compare your audience to other audiences. So you can, if you're a business, you can go through your following, you can go through your competitors' following, you can see who follows both. So there's a ton of features, and I can honestly talk about it for a long time. I literally had a call with them a couple of days ago where we were just kind of going through the platform, and the call was literally an hour and a half, and I had to jump off early, but like that's just the amount of features that this has. So I don't want to sit here for an hour and break down every single feature that SocialRank has, but that's just a bit of a quick background on who Trufan is. So how did this podcast come about? Or not this podcast, this partnership. How did this partnership come about? The short version, as some of you may know, I started my own marketing agency now. I started my own marketing agency and I run it full time. By the time this podcast comes, I'm not sure if I'll have announced that on social media or not, but that's what I'm doing now. I'm running my own marketing agency full time. I started it in January, doing it part time, and at the beginning of June, I was able to take it full time. Trufan is one of my clients. They came on board in February. That's when we started working together in my marketing agency. And what I do for Trufan is I am responsible for I manage their social media, I write their blogs, and I also am responsible for editing their podcast. And that's important. So we'll come back to that. But that is how my relationship with Trufan in a professional capacity started. But with Trufan technically being a client, I feel like it's not just a client and agency relationship. Like I feel like I'm a part of the team with Trufan. I'm on their team calls, I'm in their Slack channels. Like I said, I feel like I'm genuinely a part of the team. And so that's the short version as to how this came about. Trufan is a client, and that's where this all started. That's where this all came from. The long version is actually going to take probably longer than you're expecting it to, and it goes back further than you probably expect. So the long version, we're going to go all the way back to, I think, early 2018. This is when I'd been working at OSEG, not even a year yet. So my old job when I worked with the Auto Red Blacks and the Auto 67s, Ottawa Sports and Entertainment Group. I hadn't even been there for a year yet. And my good friend Hayden Cashin, who if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, know, he was talking to us about this guy he met named Scott Birdie. And Scott is one of the founding members of Trufan. So the founders are Swish and Onik, and Scott is their chief growth officer today, and he's one of the founding members of the company. And Scott was telling Hayden about this platform, so Hayden ended up bringing Scott in to my job to kind of show us this platform that they were working with. And so I remember being in a boardroom. That's where I first met Scott. That's where our friendship started. Essentially, we stayed in touch after that, and that's just where I first heard of Trufan, this new company, this Canadian company, social media analytics. And I was like, oh, that's pretty interesting. And so Scott and I kind of stayed in touch a little bit after that. And then May of 2019, Scott and I met up for coffee. And one, it was just to kind of catch up because Scott was living in, I believe, Toronto at that time. And so he was back in Ottawa, where I'm based. And we met up for coffee. And one of the reasons that we met up for coffee, other than to just catch up, was Scott, this startup that Scott was working for, Trufan, was starting a podcast. And Scott was going to be the host of this podcast. And knowing that I'd been doing mine for almost a year at that point, Scott just kind of wanted to pick my brain, talk about how I approach prepping for podcasts, how I handle conducting interviews. And so we just talked about this podcast. It didn't have a name. They had no guests yet. Nothing was done. This was still just an idea, and Scott was going to host it. So he really wanted to pick my brain on it. And that was where, if you followed me on social media, or if you've seen somewhere me wearing a Trufan hat, that was actually when I first got the Trufan hat. I wear it quite a bit. Some people might think that because they're a client, that's why I have it. I've actually been wearing it since Scott gave it to me after we went for coffee that day. But I remember getting home from that coffee with Scott, and I was like, you know what? I wish we'd recorded our conversation, because it would have made a great podcast. It would have been a great episode of my social life. And I literally texted Scott as I had that thought. And I was like, Scott, next time we do that conversation, we should record it with some mics and maybe turn it into a podcast. And he was like, you know what? I'd love that. So Scott was up in Ottawa, I think like a month later, and we sat down in my apartment. And at the time, so Scott's the chief growth officer at Trufan. He was the head of sales at that point, because I was just looking back at this podcast the other day, and we recorded a monster episode. It was almost 2 hours long, and we talked a lot. We talked about Trufan. We talked about Scott's career. We talked about how Scott uses LinkedIn, and we just had it was an awesome conversation. It was the 45th episode of this podcast, episode number 45. And so it was dope. And that was kind of my last touch point with Trufan for probably after that point, of course, editing the podcast, publishing it and everything, and still following them on social media. But after that, I didn't really have much interaction with Trufan directly for a while. And then Scott and I, of course, staying in touch. Scott knew I wanted to start my own marketing agency, and eventually I started one. My agency, I registered the business on December 31st. I had a couple of initial clients lined up. Scott was back in Ottawa again in late January 2020, and we were just chatting, catching up, and Scott was asking me how my agency was going. And I said, well, it was pretty good. Like, I have a couple clients right now that I'm working with, nothing too crazy. And as we got to talking, he said, you know what, why don't you write up a proposal and send it to me, and I'll send it to Swish, and we'll see if we can bring you on, if we can leverage your services with Trufan. And I was like, for sure, that'd be awesome. So I wrote a proposal, ended up going through. And one of the things that I was supposed to do for them was edit their podcast. Their podcast is called Fans First. You can go and check it out. Still exists. That was their original podcast. I think there was 9 episodes. I edited maybe half of them, 4 or 5 of the podcasts I actually edited. And then once kind of COVID hit and everything happened, the podcast got put on pause. So I wasn't editing the podcast anymore. I was still doing everything else, wasn't editing the podcast. And during that time, I'd also recorded a couple of other interviews. I recorded one with Swish. When I say a couple other, I mean Trufan related interviews on my personal podcast, on this podcast, My Social Life. I recorded episode number 77 with Swish, the CEO and co-founder of Trufan. And I recorded one with Karen O'Brien, episode number 78, the episode after Swish, and she was Trufan's first investor. So I recorded a couple of the Trufan podcasts, but the podcast Fans First, the Trufan podcast, was put on pause. And so it was put on pause, and eventually, like, we got into conversations as the months progressed. We want to relaunch the podcast, but we don't necessarily know how we want it to look. Does Trufan want to relaunch Fans First? Do we want to relaunch, or do we want to rebrand it? Do we want to launch a brand new podcast and change up the format? There was a bunch of conversations happening as to how it was going to look with the new podcast. And there was a conversation around maybe making it a newsy podcast and focusing on news in the social media space. Or, like I said, is it interviews? Do we make the interviews a very specific niche or always the same topic? Like, what is it going to look like? And these conversations were going on. And as these conversations were happening, then the conversation started happening of, okay, well, who's going to host it? Who's going to do the prep work for all the interviews or the episodes, whether it be news-based or interview-based? How are we going to do this? Who's going to do this? And then we kind of had a bit of a plan in place. And that was kind of the last I heard of it. We were just kind of planning on when we were going to relaunch it and everything. And then I get a call from Swish this was Monday, I believe. And Swish calls me and he goes, hey, we just had a meeting talking about the podcast. And we were thinking, we're not 100% sure how we're going to, like, in terms of just the feasibility of keeping it consistent with everyone being so busy. We don't know who's going to do it. Would you be interested in my social life becoming the Trufan, the official Trufan podcast? And I was like, well, that's pretty interesting. What does that entail? And Swish kind of ran me through a couple of the details about what it would be about. And I was like, yeah, can I just think about it? He was like, yeah, for sure, no problem. So I called him back the next day. I'm like, yeah, I'm interested. My big thing with this partnership was I just wanted to make sure, my biggest thing was that this podcast remains mine. That's where we stand. This podcast is part of our agreement. The partnership agreement is that I still own the podcast. So that's one of the big things. I kind of want to get into what this looks like. So now that I've agreed to this partnership, I've entered into a partnership with Trufan. What does that mean for the podcast? What's going to happen? What's changing? What's not changing? So like I said, I'm remaining the owner of this podcast. I'm 100% owner. That's not changing. The interviews, the takeaways episodes, those aren't changing either. That's it. They're staying the exact same. The creative freedom. That's one thing Swish said. When it comes to the podcast, I still have full creative freedom. I have control of the niche of the podcast, who I interview, the questions. I am still in 100% creative control. I own this podcast. That's not changing. The only minor tweaks that are going to happen with the regular episodes is at the beginning and ending of each podcast, I will let you know that it is now powered by Trufan. I'll say at the beginning of the interviews, the end of the interviews, the beginning and ending of the takeaways episodes. Like I said, I'll always say powered by Trufan, except for I believe one episode that I've already pre-recorded. I panicked because I was just trying so hard to remember. Don't forget to mention Trufan. And I said presented by, but it is actually powered by. That's the wording we're using. This podcast is powered by Trufan. So that's the biggest thing that's probably going to change in terms of the actual podcast structure right now. The interviews are happening every single Monday at 5 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Takeaways episodes every single Thursday. Did I say Friday? Interviews every single Monday at 5 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Takeaways episodes every single Thursday at 5 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. What else is going to be changing is there will be a Trufan logo on the cover of the podcast, of course. That's pretty standard. Going to put some Trufan logos on the social media assets as well. I want to give them as much exposure with this podcast as I can. So that's kind of my side, is I have to plug them in the podcast, let everyone know that this podcast is now powered by Trufan, put their logo on some social media assets to give them as much exposure as I can. And on their side, what they're doing as part of this partnership is they're going to introduce me to their contacts, their networks, to help the podcast get bigger named guests and increase its reach. They are some very well-connected people. They have they have a very powerful platform that a lot of renowned people use. So they're going to help introduce me to people to grow my network and get bigger name guests on this podcast. Another thing they're going to do is they asked if I can have the podcast on their website, which of course. So they're going to help the podcast gain exposure by featuring it on their website, by promoting it on their social media channels, which I mean, technically I'll be the one posting it, but that was part of the agreement that I also provide them the assets from the podcast for them to use on their social media channels. Because again, this is more than just a sponsorship. I know I use sponsor, I use different words, but it is a partnership. I'm helping provide them with quality content and exposure through my podcast, and they're going to help me grow my podcast. And that's the biggest thing. So it is the Trufan company podcast, but I just want to make sure that with everyone listening, that I want to make sure the distinction was clear that I still own it, but it is the Trufan company podcast. So I'm really excited for this, for the partnership. I think one other thing actually that is going to be changing. There's going to be one new episode every single month. That's right. So what the new episode is going to be, it's not going to replace an interview. There's still going to be interviews every Monday. There's going to be takeaways every single Thursday, but we're doing one new episode. So you might have remembered, I mentioned earlier that one of the potential ideas for for the Trufan podcast before they asked me if I would enter into a partnership with them was a news podcast talking about big and important news in the social media space, influencer marketing space, which happens to play right into this podcast. This podcast is about people doing interesting things on social media. I interview a lot of influencers. I interview social media managers. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take that idea and we're going to bring it into my social life. there's going to be a new episode. It's going to be called The Social Report. And it's going to be myself, Scott from Trufan, who, like I said, past guest of this podcast, Chief Growth Officer at Trufan, and Cam. Cam is their Director of Growth Marketing. And we're going to do a roundtable, and we're going to talk about and let you know what some of the biggest social media news is from the last month. We're going to break it down. We're going to talk about why it's important and its impact. I think it's a really nice addition to the podcast. It's aligned with everything we're doing right now. It's going to help keep you informed. I'm excited for it. I think one thing I always debated, like, I believe, actually a little bit of a story I've never told before, is a social media news type show was never something I considered for my podcast, but I was trying to figure out a YouTube strategy for myself that was aligned with the podcast. And I was like, what if I talk about social news on my YouTube channel? This was a thought probably like a year ago, I want to say. And it never happened, just a bandwidth thing. I couldn't make it work. But to have the ability to bring that into my social life, into the podcast, like I said, it's not going to be overwhelming. Like, it's just with the amount of work that this podcast requires, doing it every week isn't feasible, but once a month is feasible. So we're going to do, like I said, once a month, we're going to sit down, have a round table, break down some social media news, why it's important and its impact. I'm really excited. We haven't recorded the first episode of the Social Report yet, but I'm really looking forward to sitting down and doing that. Like I said, I think it's going to be a great extension of this podcast, and I really hope you enjoy it. And I thought this was going to be a 5-minute bonus episode. We're definitely past that point, but I want to talk about another thing too, in terms of this partnership, why this makes so much sense as a sponsor. So since I started this podcast, if you've listened to, I don't even know what exact episodes it was, but if you've listened throughout the last 2 years, there's been podcasts, mainly takeaways episodes where it's me talking by myself, but there's been takeaways episodes where I've said that I'm not going to do a sponsorship or enter into a partnership or do anything with the podcast if it doesn't make sense. I wouldn't do it too early, to a point where my two main criteria in terms of doing a sponsorship was, one, it had to make sense for the podcast. I wasn't going to promote something I didn't believe in, that didn't align with the people that listen to this podcast. That was big. And two, I wasn't going to do a sponsorship just to try and quote unquote cash out. And I wasn't going to do one super early on where I was going to be doing a sponsorship or a partnership just to try and get a couple extra bucks where it wasn't worth my while. But this one makes perfect sense, which is why I'm doing this now at this time. Trufan and Social Rank, they're perfectly aligned with this podcast. This podcast, like I said, is the stories behind the people on social media. This is a social media specific podcast, and they're a social media platform, a social media analytics platform. So that, in terms of that sense, it makes perfect sense for this podcast. It's a sponsor and a partnership. Again, I just keep saying sponsor. It is a partnership. It's more than just a sponsorship, but it's a partnership that makes sense. It's a product that I also genuinely believe in. Like I said, they're one of my clients. I don't work with businesses that I don't believe in. That's a big thing. But it's an awesome product. And again, I'm reiterating, because I know this sounds like an ad and this is a partnership, but I'm not being paid. This whole podcast episode was my idea. It's an awesome product. I highly recommend you use it. I've used it for other clients to help with some influencer marketing stuff that I've done. So it's a product that I truly believe in. A product that I believe in that is aligned with the values and the niche of this podcast. And two, we're going about, or three, I guess. The other thing of why this makes a lot of sense for the podcast is we're going about it in a tasteful way. I'm still the owner of the podcast. I'm still responsible for doing the interviews, doing the prep work, the creative direction, the clips that I post are me, the posting on the Instagram account is me. It's all still me. Nothing about the podcast is really changing with this. Like I said, I'm going to help them gain some exposure with some shout outs in the episodes and some social assets. And they're going to help me by sourcing guests, some high profile guests, some interesting people that will also be interesting to you, my listeners. Because that's an important part of my decision-making factors, the people that listen to this podcast. So the fact that we're going about this partnership in such a tasteful way was just perfect for me. So those three things, the one that they are just perfectly aligned with the niche of the show, that it's a product I genuinely believe in, working with people as well that I genuinely like to work with. Everyone at Trufan, like I said, with them being a client, I feel like I'm a part of the team there. Even though I'm not a technical employee, I still consider myself a part of the team. I like everybody there. It's just, they're great people, great product, great people. I'm excited to, like I said, to record the Social Report with Cam and Scott. I think that's going to be a fun episode and a fun series kind of moving forward once a month. But yeah, like I said, company I believe in, product that is perfectly aligned with the niche and values of this podcast. And we're going about it in like such a tasteful way. So I'm so excited for this sponsorship, this partnership. I'm going to get that right eventually. I don't want to. One big thing is why I'm doing that, why that's happening in terms of me using different words. Whenever I'm writing copy, I try not to use the same words in reoccurring sentences, which is why I haven't just been using exclusively partnership. But again, this is more than a sponsorship. This is a partnership. I'm really excited. We're going about it in the best way possible. I'm looking forward to the future of this podcast. I think there's some big things coming. I'm excited to record. Like I said, we haven't recorded the first episode of the social report yet, but I'm really excited to do that. I think you guys are really going to enjoy it. And again, I just want to take a second to thank my listeners. Thank you, the person listening to this podcast. Whether this is the first of my podcasts you've ever listened to, or if you've listened to the last 170 something uploads, which is crazy to say. I've done 90 to the point of this episode is that I've done 91 interviews, but with the takeaways and bonus episodes, I'm up over 170 podcast uploads. If you've listened to every single one or even just one of those along the way, I genuinely appreciate you taking the time out of your day, out of your life to listen to this podcast. I put a lot of work into this. This podcast is my baby. So I appreciate you. And I think this partnership is going to be really good for the podcast. I don't think that, honestly, it's a win-win to me. There was nothing really that I didn't hesitate with this. I didn't hesitate once the details were clear. Where I hesitated was I just wanted to make sure that this podcast remained mine. That's my biggest thing. And the second I knew that, this isn't an acquisition, this is a partnership, I was sold. I think this is perfect for the podcast. I think this is going to be really good for the podcast. I'm so excited for the future of this show. I hope you are too. Like I said, if this is your first time or your 170th time, I appreciate you listening to this podcast. If you enjoyed me ranting on this partnership that I'm clearly, as you can tell, very excited for, please consider leaving a rating and a review. The more positive ratings and reviews this podcast gets, the more likely new people are going to discover this podcast. And if you're one of the people that have recently found this podcast, welcome. I'm very excited to have you here. If you've listened this entire way and you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing. I put out brand new interviews every single Monday, takeaways episodes where I sit down by myself and break down the most recent podcast episode of the week every single Thursday. And now, once a month, we're putting out a social report where we break down the biggest news in social media from the last 30 days. Thank you once again for listening to this, everybody. We'll talk soon.